Hello, I'm Tael, and welcome to Tael Talks. And today I'd like to talk to you about a little game called Gears of War 2. Now, for those of you not in the know, Gears of War 2 was a game developed in the Unreal Engine 3. It was developed by Epic Games, with Cliff Bleszinski overseeing it, and it was published by Microsoft. Released in November 2008. And I remember it coming out very, very well and having a friend come over and playing through most of the game in co-op in one sitting. So I have a lot of fond memories of this game. Now, before this game came out, Cliff Bleszinski actually promised the game would be bigger, better, and more badass. And the thing about that is, he was right, the game was. But in the process, there were some sacrifices. And so that's what I'm going to be focusing on in this particular video review. So obviously Gears of War 2 is a sequel, and instead of focusing on the game as a whole, I want to focus on how it compares to the original. So I guess the first thing that's really worth talking about is what hasn't changed. And really the most apparent thing is the combat. The combat is just as dynamic as it always was. Everything still feels fantastic. The thing was, there was actually less of it, which is something I'll get into later on. But for the most part, the combat feels just as fantastic, if not better, than it did before, and there's a number of reasons for that. Likewise, the sound design for the game is absolutely phenomenal, with all the guns sounding incredibly beefy and powerful, and all the enemies, of course, still sounding just as threatening as they did in the original. And the score, the same composer, I've forgotten his name off the top of my head, the same composer came back to score the soundtrack, and once again, it's a phenomenal soundtrack and well worth checking out if you haven't. And last but not least, all the voice actors from the original return, and they all do a fantastic job, again, with a special shout out going to Carlos Ferro's performance as Dom. Dom gets some things to do in this game that you don't see a lot of in gaming in general, and I think his performance out of everyone is the one that really stands out the most. But that's where all the similarities end between the two games. What's improved? And that's a very important question. Well, as Cliff said, he wanted the game to be bigger. And of course, by bigger he means much bigger scope. There is times in this game where you'll see what looks like hundreds of locusts running around, doing their own thing. It gives the original Gears was very much focused on tight corridors and little areas where you could fight, and there'd be X amount of locusts, like maybe 5 or 6 you could see at the same time. This game will show you hundreds of locusts in the distance, and some of them you can actually mow down in a number of sequences. And when that, especially when it came out, it was incredibly impressive, and it really did give that sense of like, okay, this is a big war that's going on. Something that the original one didn't quite have. Likewise, the art direction is a little bit more varied. There's a much more diverse color palette, and it really builds on what was established in the original game in terms of both above the surface and below the surface. In general, it just feels like a much more varied experience. There's a lot less time spent in crumbling cities and things like that than the original game had. And I think that variety really helped the game in a lot of ways. It still felt like the original Gears, but because of these new environments and how much more diverse they were, it didn't feel like you were retreading old ground, which was incredibly important. The weapons feel even chunkier. The new weapons in the game, which there are some fantastic new ones, with the mortar being a particular favorite of mine. I absolutely love using that thing. And also I think it's the Gorgon pistol, which you get off the Locust Templar. Or they're like Templars, they're like priest things. Those are, I really, really love that weapon as well. It's a pistol that shoots like in bursts of 3, and that's a really good feeling weapon. So the new weapons that they have in there feel powerful and beefy, and they actually managed to make the weapons from the original feel even stronger and more powerful than they were in the first one. But that, I don't think they actually tampered with the amount of power that they actually had, but they definitely felt that little bit chunkier, and that's probably got a lot to do with the sound design actually, but just really, really cleverly done. Likewise, the active reload system, which was obviously incredibly important to the original game and already felt great, they actually managed to tighten this up even more, and I was really surprised jumping from Gears 1 to Gears 2 just how much tighter it felt doing the active reloads. For those who didn't watch the original one, the active reload is, when you reload you get a quick window where you can tap a particular button and it doubles the speed of your reload, or it quickens the animation, and it keeps combat flowing at a relatively quick pace. So the fact that this somehow even feels smoother and tighter is actually really impressive, and I don't actually know how they did it or what changed, but it is something that you can definitely feel while you're playing the game, and I think that's actually quite amazing that they can do something that you notice without being able to work out what exactly changed. I think that's quite cool. Something there is a lot more of in this game than the original is the vehicles. Now, I didn't really touch on the vehicle sections in my original Gears of War review. There is one sequence where you're traveling at night in like a tank, through a downtown area, and the tank has a light mounted to it which you use to scare off these creatures called Krill. And I didn't really mention it because it plays such a small part in the game, it's such a small segment. There are a ton of vehicles in this game. You'll be using tanks, you'll be riding on Reavers, you'll be riding a Brumac, which I'll get to later. There is a much bigger focus on vehicles, and I think it's a good thing and a bad thing. The vehicles all feel really good, they're really fun to use. In general, the vehicle sections are a lot of fun. A lot more fun than the vehicle section was in the original Gears. And I do really enjoy them, and I'm glad they're there in a lot of ways. So I think, is that an improvement? Yes it is, and no it isn't, which I'll get into later on. Something that is strange, and I guess it's because of the way the game is paced, is it's not until the last chapter that I really felt like I was playing something that felt like the original Gears. I think up until that point, there's a lot of variety in the game. Something that the original Gears didn't have a lot of was variety in terms of gameplay. And then the last section feels like classic Gears. It's like four stages or acts or whatever of just pure cover-based shooting, and it's brilliant. And that sequence itself feels like a really great climax. But then the game does something really, really awesome. As I mentioned before, you get to ride a Brumac. This is one of my favorite things in the game. That last act is incredibly difficult compared to all the gameplay before it. I feel like this game's a lot easier than the original, especially if you play it on normal. I wouldn't recommend playing it on normal if you've played through another Gears game, because it's an absolute cakewalk. Definitely play this game on hard if you've played the original Gears, but this last stage ramps up the difficulty significantly. And you get a real sense of accomplishment once you've completed that. And then as a reward, the game does this fantastic thing where it gives you a Brumac to ride. And the Brumac, it can be hurt, but it's for the most part virtually indestructible, and you can kill 20 guys at once with one shot from this thing, and it is the most satisfying power trip, and one of the greatest rewards I can think of in a video game in the last decade, honestly. And the fact that this reward isn't a unlockable or an item or something like that, it's an actual gameplay mechanic that you get as a reward for successfully doing something, I think is fucking brilliant and really, really intelligent game design. And I wish there was more of this sort of thing in games. I really can't give them enough for this, for the way this game closes out with this Brumac sequence. It's a brilliant reward for a difficult sequence. Something else this game does that the original one doesn't is actually it can be quite emotional at times. There's a number of touching moments in Gears of War 2 which are incredibly surprising, and I really wasn't expecting the first time I played it. And playing through it again recently, I kind of forgot how well done they were. Gears of War is a dumb 80s popcorn action movie third-person shooter, and really it has no right of being touching, to be quite honest, but the game manages to do that. Not once, but twice, actually. One particular character, something happens to them which completely comes out of nowhere and is unexpected, and it's still, I wouldn't say it choked me up, but I still think it's quite impressive the way they handled it. And then there's another moment after that, a little bit after that, where Dom finds his wife that's also incredibly well handled. I guess that's what I should say. I shouldn't say it's touching. It's very hard to handle the sort of themes that those particular scenes are dealing with, and I think a lot of games would fuck them up pretty bad, but I think Gears does a stupidly surprising good job of covering these heavier themes in amongst all the noise and popcorn action. And I think they really should be commended for the way they handled that, because they really could have gone, both of these sequences could have gone absolutely horribly, but because of the thought that they've put into it, they pull them off quite successfully, and I think it's quite amazing. Lastly, in terms of things that have improved on, there's the story, which actually makes sense now. Basically, Marcus and friends, I'll call them, are trying to stop the Locusts from sinking all their cities, and then they do stop them, and then they realize that they can stop the Locusts if they sink their last city themselves. And that's it. That's the plot. It's really easy to follow. There's a giant worm. It's pretty easy to follow, unlike the original, where I still don't know what was happening. So I think that's definitely worth pointing out as like something that's been fixed. Also, that worm, I know some people don't like it. For me personally, that worm sequence is a very clever use of the third-person cover system in a non-shooting way, and I'm glad they experimented with it, even if other people didn't like it. Lastly, I have to put this one in here. This is a really small thing, but if you've seen my original Gears of War review, you'll notice that I mentioned the fact that there were lambent wrenches working with the Locust and the final stage, and how they felt like they were put there just to artificially increase the difficulty of the stage instead of being there for logical reasons. Gears of War 2 fixes that by introducing another creature called the Tickers, which are basically just ticks with dynamite strapped to their back, and they work effectively the exact same as the Wretches do. But they're not Lambent. The Locusts actually physically strap the explosives to these creatures, so I think the guys at Epic realized, oh hey, we can't have these Lambent Wrenches working with the Locusts, that doesn't make sense, we needed an alternative, and so I think that's where the Tickers were born from, and I have to thank them a lot for introducing that. As much as I love Gears of War 2, and I think it's a better game than the original in a lot of ways, it does have a few issues, and none of these things are particularly game-breaking or would even come close to ruining anyone's experience. They're all actually quite minor things, so I feel quite bad for even bringing some of these up. But they are things that disappointed me as a fan of Gears replaying this again. So as I mentioned, normal mode, which is quite difficult in Gears, the first time you play through it at least, has been turned into an absolute cakewalk and is a waste of time. And I think the whole idea of Gears, or why it's satisfying, is successfully getting through these combat scenarios. And if the game's easy, then there's, you don't get that sense of satisfaction. I think it's sad that's missing. Also, the villain, who I've completely forgotten the name of, he's like a guy with, he's like Darth Maul with himself having a double lightsaber. He's got 2 chainsaws, and it's just, he looks kind of like the Predator, and he just doesn't feel very inspired, and he just does what the Queen tells him, and he's not particularly interesting, and you fight him in a boss fight, and it's pretty dull, and then when you kill him, he's just riding on a giant Reaver, and you just kill the Reaver and he dies when that goes down, which is pretty sad. Just another weak villain. I find Gears' biggest weakness is probably its villains, actually, throughout the entire series. Now, going back to something I said earlier, there's a lot of set pieces with the scale and everything in this game, and I think it's a fantastic addition to the game in a lot of ways, but it also detracts in a lot of ways. And what I mean by that is the original Gears was a third-person shooter almost exclusively, and it was refined to a T as a third-person shooter. Gears of War 2 has, because of the focus on vehicles and other set pieces and things like that, it's lost that focus for me personally as a third-person shooter. And while I do really enjoy the third-person shooter elements that are in there, and I do enjoy the other elements, I can't say that it's a great third-person shooter because there's so much less of it than was in the original, if that makes sense. And I guess it doesn't ruin the game for me at all. I think it is a superior game to the original Gears of War in a lot of ways, in terms of pure fun. But if you want to sit down to play just a third-person shooter, other than playing online obviously, then I would still recommend that you go and play the original. And it's sad that that's the way Gears of War 2 leaves me feeling. And so something that's missing from the game that I loved in the first one is the Krill. There's a few levels in this game that take place at night, but the Krill have all but vanished for some reason. They did replace them with something called Razor Hail in a particular level, which was just hail that you try to avoid, but it's just nowhere near as interesting or threatening as the Krill were in the original, and I think it's kind of a little bit sad that they're missing. There's also some really, really weird inclusions, the most apparent one being the Sires, which are these weird human locust hybrids that you find in a lab. I don't know why they're in there other than to mix the gameplay up a bit and to give it a little bit of a survival horror feel. They don't really... There's no resolution to this story. There's nothing about them in Gears 3. There's nothing about them in the end of Gears. You just go to this place, these things are there, and then you never hear about them again, like it was never important in the first place. They are fun to fight, so I can give them that. Maybe they were just there for variety's sake, and I guess in real life you don't always get all the answers to everything, but narratively it's just kind of hollow and they feel kind of superfluous, and I just don't know why the Sires are in there. I don't think it's bad that they're in there, I just wish there was a little bit more context or some sort of resolution to why they're there. Lastly, there are the Lambent. Obviously, there were Lambent Wretches in the original, and in this game, there's mentioning of Lambent at the end of the game. So really, you only get to fight a Lambent Brumac at the end of the game, and you know it's not quite the same thing. And I don't know that it's a good thing or a bad thing that isn't as big of a focus. I mean, Gears 3 there is a massive focus on the Lambent. Gears 1 had a very small focus on the Lambent. It was dropping seeds. I don't even know if the Lambent was thought of as an actual thing that it is in the context of the whole series at that point. But their inclusion feels kind of weird, because you never actually get that sort of sense of what they are or why the Locusts are afraid of them or at war with them, and I think that kind of hurts the ending a little bit. Not a ton, but a little bit. I feel like it weakens the story a little bit. I wish there was just a little bit tighter and there was a little bit more information about the Lambent in there, but you know, I'm not going to complain too long about it because it is a pretty small thing. Overall though, like I said, Gears of War 2, I think, in terms of a pure video game, it is a better game than Gears of War 1. Is it a better third-person shooter than Gears of War 1? I don't think so. Even with the new weapons and the tighter controls and active reload, I still would prefer to play Gears of War 1 if I want to sit down and play strictly a third-person shooter. But the pacing, the combat, and the scope are all really impressive. It's just a shame that the focus on all these things kind of detracts from the gameplay in some respects. I wish the Gears 2 felt less like a Michael Bay movie and more like the dark, gritty war game that the original Gears was. That said, Gears 2 is a fantastic game. If you haven't played it, definitely recommend it. Definitely play through the first one first, and definitely play it on hard. But Gears 2, really, like, my problems with it are negligible at best, and really shouldn't detract from your experience at all. So, all in all, yeah, play it. Definitely. Go for it. What about you? What do you think about Gears of War 2? Do you agree or disagree with anything I've said here? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, favorite, and subscribe. And thank you again for tuning in to Tael Talks. It's always a pleasure having you guys there listening to me. Thank you again, and I'll see you next week.